recording. Here we go. Okay, now it's recording. Okay. So here, what I'm going to begin with is section 1.2. 1.2 is on quadratic equations. You know, last time we looked at section 1.1, which were linear equations, okay? And in that section, we actually saw some vocabulary and how we can go about solving equations. I mean, there was that big method that said you can add something to both sides, you can multiply or divide by the same non-zero number. Those steps you can use to solve any kind of equation, okay? With linear equations, it's a little bit easier because there's only one solution and the manipulation is not as bad. Here, though, with quadratic equations, it does get a little bit tricky, but again, we are still looking for solutions, okay? And what's nice about quadratic equations is, well, for one thing, we can use factoring to solve a quadratic equation. So here, I guess, is one application of factoring. I mean, factoring itself is very useful. Essentially, remember, you're taking a polynomial, you know, you're taking it apart piece by piece, so to say. And the pieces and the idea is that the pieces that you break it up into, they're easier to deal with. We will also see another method called the quadratic formula, and that you can actually use to solve any quadratic equation. I mean, factoring, you can learn more about the polynomial than from the quadratic formula, but the quadratic formula is still very useful. There are other methods in the book. There's actually, for instance, something called, I think it's called the square root method, which is something else. Another nice method, actually. There's also, I mean, there's graphing, of course, but graphing is not as exact as these methods. What was it? There was another one called, can't think of the word, completing the square. Couldn't think of the word for some reason, the phrase, I guess. Completing the square is actually how you derive the quadratic formula. It is a very nice process, but for time considerations, I'm only going to focus on these two. Okay? I'm only going to focus on these two. All right, that's good. So again, just like before with equations, we need some vocabulary. So what is a quadratic equation? Well, this is what it is basically. It's an equation that you can write in this form. Now, when I say write in this form, what I mean is any of those techniques that we use to solve an equation, you know, add something to both sides, multiply or divide by the same non-zero number, that kind of thing, or simplifying either side. If you can use those methods and obtain this, if you can obtain this, then it's a quadratic equation. That's what we mean by can be written as. In other words, it's equivalent to this. So essentially, it's not like a linear equation where you just have b times x plus c. Here, we're kicking it up a notch, so to say, in that we have a polynomial of degree 2, a quadratic. And so a, b, and c are numbers, but a cannot be 0 here. You know, otherwise, we're back in section 1.1. Okay, and we did that section already. And let me just say this about the number of solutions. It turns out there's no more than 2. You could have 2 solutions. You could have just 1. And because we're not dealing with complex numbers, it is possible we can have no solutions. If we allow complex numbers, we might get to that. I don't know, not in this section though. But if we do allow complex numbers, then there would always be one solution at least. That's actually a very important theorem called the fundamental theorem of algebra. And really a consequence of that is there's at most 2 real solutions to this equation. And just like we saw in the first slide, here we're going to see 2 methods for solving this. One of them is factoring. The other one is the quadratic formula. On an exam, quiz, or whatever, I will tell you what method to use. Don't, then you can use either method you want. And that reminds me also, the quiz, the second quiz is posted, okay, in case you haven't seen it yet. Some people did submit it already, and that's fine. Just letting you know. All right, so we have this. All right, let's keep going. So let me show you how to solve this kind of equation by factoring. So basically the idea is this. We're going to factor this into a product of factors. So we're going to factor completely. In other words, we're going to factor until we can't factor it anymore. And the idea is from each factor, we get a solution. And this example will demonstrate that. So this is actually something we've encountered before. This particular quadratic, that is. Notice there are three terms, right? Three wonderful terms. It's degree 2. So yes, we have a quadratic equation, but since the leading coefficient is 1, this is actually not so hard to factor, right? What we want are two numbers whose product is 10 and whose sum is 7. Okay, so as before, we actually saw that the numbers that work are 5 and 2. So those work because, again, those two numbers, their product is 10 and their sum is 7. Okay, so as we have seen before, we can factor this thing into this product. From there, right, since this was equal to 0, right, we get this product is 0, which is where this comes from. Now, one of the things that's very nice about multiplication with real numbers and complex numbers also is that if you have a product equal to 0, then at least one of the factors has to be 0. I think it's called the zero product property, if I remember correctly. But basically, from that property, we get the next line here. This line says, right, that since this product is 0, what must happen is the first or the second factor has to be 0. They both could be, but at least one of them has to be. And really from there, to solve this equation, we have to solve this, or, excuse me, we have to solve this equation, and we have to solve this. Because again, we're looking for all possible numbers that make this equation true, right? And we get that by solving both of these. And these are actually easier to deal with, right? So this really also demonstrates why factoring is important and useful. You're taking something, I mean, this wasn't too terrible, this polynomial, but you see that you end up with something that's easier to deal with, right? I mean, if you asked me to deal with this or this, you know, I would rather deal with these factors. Okay? All right. So we have to solve that. Okay, now how do we solve that? Well, that's actually pretty easy, right? You have to isolate x. So essentially, you can solve them both at the same time if you want. Here's the first one, right? We have x plus 5 equal to 0, right? You want to get x all alone, so we subtract 5 from each side, and we get this. And the other one is the exact same idea, right? Instead of 5, you have a 2, but the process is the same, as you can see. Okay, that's great. So we have our two solutions to the original equation. We have -5 and we have -2. Two solutions. So this quadratic equation we had had two solutions. And as before, it doesn't hurt to check. So we're doing that here. And of course you get this, and of course the equations are satisfied, right? That's what it means to be a solution. You know, you plug it in for the variable, which is x for us usually, and the equation holds. Awesome. Okay, that's good. Now, this really demonstrated the process of solving by factoring. Now, before I move on, let me just pause the recording.